Good morning, students. How is everyone doing today? I want to welcome all of you to our Aquarium Online Academy with the Aquarium of the Pacific. My name is Erin. I'm joining you from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, and I'm really excited to get to chat with all of you today because we're going to be learning all about fish. So we're going to get to take a deeper dive into some of our exhibits, see if we can compare some different types of fish, and learn a little bit more about how fish adaptations help them to survive. So if you are watching this live, that is Friday, June 18th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, then you can text us questions to right here at the aquarium. We'll answer them live on the air. We'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can. And our number is right here. It's 562-286-1838. Again, that's 562-286-1838. So text us all the questions you have about fish. If you're watching this at a later date, so after June 18th, you can also email us questions to live@lbaop.org, and we'll get back to those as soon as we can. So we're going to be learning today, like I said, all about fish. And here we have a live view into one of our exhibits here at the aquarium. This is our coral predators exhibit, and we've got lots of different types of tropical fish. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a second and make some observations about the fish that you can see here in this exhibit. What are some things that you notice? Hopefully some will swim by the camera. What are some things that you notice about these fish? And I want to think specifically about what are the adaptations that make a fish a fish. So when you're looking at these animals, how can you tell that they are fish and not a mammal or a bird or a reptile? What is it that makes them a fish? What are those adaptations that makes a fish a fish? And if you know, go ahead and give us a text at that number so you can tell us exactly what it is that makes a fish a fish. Again, here's that number. Now I see we have one of our trigger fish over here. We've also got several other fish swimming around in the background. We can already see some of this diversity of these different types of fish. We'll talk a little bit more about that diversity in a little bit. But I want to think about what makes a fish a fish. Now, looking at this triggerfish right here is giving us a really great example of one of those things, and that is the fins. So fish have fins. They might be you might see some fins on the side. They also sometimes will have dorsal fins or a tail. Let's get a closer look at a fish, just any fish, so that we can examine those fins a little bit better. So this here is a butterfly fish, and again, we see that it's a little tough to see because the fins are kind of hard to see, but it has fins on the side. Some fish use those side fins for moving through the water. Other fish move through the water using their tail fin. And then they have some sort of dorsal fin as well, and then usually a fin on the bottom also. So fins, those are one of the characteristics in order to be considered a fish. What's another characteristic in order to be considered a fish? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with how they breathe. Everyone take a nice big deep breath. Now you, as a mammal, use your lungs to breathe. So when you take in a big deep breath, you pull in that air, and your body's able to pull that oxygen out of the air that you breathe in. Fish are breathing in a very different way because they don't have lungs. So instead, what they use are their gills. So if you're saying gills, you are correct. Fish use their gills to breathe. So they've got these gills on the side. And actually what we see when we look at a fish, we're really just seeing their gill covering and their gill slit, their gill opening basically. So that's what you see right here. But inside of this body part, they've got this thing that kind of looks like feathers. They've got this really feathery thing. And what happens is the fish swims through the water. And as it's swimming through the water's going to go in through their mouth, and then it passes out over their gills and out of that gill opening. And that's how they're able to breathe. So those feathery things inside, those gills, those pull the oxygen out of the water. So that's how they're able to breathe. So here we have this fish is a California sheephead. It's a fish that's found in our local kelp forests. And it's one example of a fish that we have here at the aquarium. And so we can see that gill opening. So we know that fish have fins and fish have gills. There's one other thing that we want to look at that helps to make a fish, and that is the scales. Why do fish have scales on their body? What is the benefit of having scales? Here we have a Garibaldi. This is another local California species. And it's really hard to see the scales on a fish because they're really small. They're like a clear kind of, they almost look like a clear piece of plastic or something like that. And they cover their body, and those scales help to protect them. So they give them kind of this coating that helps to keep them safe. So they're a protective layer. And they kind of are just like that outside layer. So you know how mammals have fur and birds have feathers. Fish have scales, and the scales help to protect their body. So those are the three main things in order to be considered a fish: is fins, gills, and scales. Now, of course, there are always animals that are going to go against the rules. So there are some types of fish that don't have scales, or there's some types of fish. Here's an example of one of our fish without scales. So this is an eel. This is a moray eel. And if you were to touch their body, they would be really smooth. And that's because they don't have those scales on their body. So there are examples of fish that are kind of breaking the rules, like this eel here. But what's this here? This looks a little bit different than that sheep head we were looking at, but that's basically their gill opening. So that's where that water will pass out. So when you see an eel and he's sitting there, it's kind of opening its mouth. It kind of looks like it's making a scary face. What it's doing is it's just breathing. So it's bringing that water in through their mouth, and by going up and down and opening up their mouth like that, that's how they're able to bring that water into their mouth. Then it passes out over their gills through this gill opening, and that's how they're able to breathe. So we are already seeing there's a lot of different types of fish. There's a lot of diversity within the fish. There can be different shapes, different sizes, different colors. They can be very, very different. And a lot of those differences come from where they live and how they live. So you can learn a lot about a fish just by looking at it and making observations about that fish. So I want to take a second. While we're looking at a local California species, let's go to a local California habitat. And we're going to make some observations about some of the fish that are living in that habitat. So we're going to go to our blue cavern exhibit, and we're going to get a second to take a look at our local kelp forest animals. And we're going to look at those fish, and we're going to see how do the adaptations that these fish in blue cavern, how do these adaptations help them to survive? So while you're looking at these fish, there's a couple things I want you to notice. I want you to look at their coloration. I want you to look at their fins. And I want you to look at their mouth. So those things will tell you a lot about how an animal lives. What color is it? What is it? What do its fins look like? And what does its mouth look like? And that's going to tell you so much. Now, while you're making those observations, we have some questions rolling in. So we're going to get a chance to look at some questions. The first question is someone wants to hear about jawless fish and spiny lumpsuckers. Now, spiny lumpsuckers are my favorite fish that we have here at the aquarium. They look like little teeny tiny round balls. We're going to see if we have a picture of them, but they look like these little balls, and their name is lumpsucker because they look kind of like a lump, and they actually have this part on their bottom of their body that's like a sucker. Now, remember how I was saying we can learn a lot about fish by making observations about them. Once we get a chance to see this fish, you're going to be able to learn a lot about it. One thing that I think you'll notice is that it doesn't have very big fins. It's not a very good swimmer, and so it has to have other adaptations to survive. And that's why it sucks onto things like rocks, because it's not a very good swimmer, so it needs to hold on in another way. So this animal is not going to swim around a lot. It might swim for small distances, but it's going to spend most of its time hanging out on a particular rock. That's one of those things that you'll notice about that spiny lumpsucker. I'm being joined today by Stacy here in the studio. She's controlling everything you see behind me. So she, I think, is looking to see if we have a picture of a lumpsucker. Oh, here we go. Looks like we found one. There's a suspense because it's just so cute. Oh my goodness, there you go. So look at these tiny fins like we talked about. Teeny tiny fins. This fish is really small. It's maybe about a small gumball sized or smaller. And you can see it's got these really, really small fins. And then it has the ability to kind of suck onto things like rocks or kelp and hold on that way instead. It's really similar to how a seahorse uses its tail to hook onto something so that they don't float away. More questions. Awesome. I love these questions. Keep them coming. Our next question is, what do fish do all day? That's a really great question. So like a lot of animals, they have to meet all of their needs. So they have to do things like find food. They do things like hide to stay safe from predators. Maybe they will reproduce. So there's a lot of different things that they do just to help them to survive. So it really depends on the type of fish. One thing that I think is really interesting, though, is that we see differences in fish based on what temperature water they're in. So if they live in warm water, we notice that everything happens a lot faster. So they eat a lot more frequently. It takes less time for their babies to grow. It takes less time for their eggs to hatch. Everything just happens really quickly if they live in warm water like these tropical animals. If we look at cold water fish that live in the cold waters of like the northern Pacific, or even right here off our coast in California, things happen a lot more slowly. So maybe they don't eat as often. Maybe they'll eat once a day or every other day, as opposed to eating a bunch of times every single day. Their eggs will take a lot longer to hatch. Their babies take longer to grow. Everything just happens more slowly in cold water. Do fish learn from humans? That's a really good question. I would say that fish learn from food. So fish are really food motivated, just like most animals. So we have had some instances before here at the aquarium where fish start to recognize that they get fed in a certain area, and so maybe they start to spend more time in that area. Maybe they've noticed that when a person comes up to the exhibit, sometimes they get fed, so maybe they will go and swim towards the window when the person comes up to the exhibit. Whatever it might be, we notice that sometimes they might get some bit of training, basically, whether it's intentional or not, to swim to a certain area based on food. What fish are we most related to? That's a good question. So fish are kind of in their own separate category. So people are very, very distant relatives of fish. They are vertebrates like we are. So they're more closely related to us than something like a jelly, but they're pretty distant relatives. And are there any fish that don't use gills? I think gills are the one of those three characteristics. Remember, we looked at fins, gills, and scales. The gills are the one that is universal. There is a fish called a mud skipper that breathes a little bit differently. What they do is they basically have, it's kind of like a reverse scuba tank. So you know how when people go scuba diving, they bring a tank full of air. Mud skippers basically can go up on land and they're able to like hold water in their body, but they still do use gills. So I don't think there's any fish that don't use gills. That's a great question, though. We have, I think, 2 more questions, and then we'll get back to blue cavern observations. Why can't fish live on land? Great question. It's because of their breathing. So they breathe water, so they do have to spend their time in the water so that they're able to breathe. And the mud skipper is really that exception to that. They live in really muddy areas, so they'll spend part of their lives in the water, part of their lives in the really moist area right next to the water. So they can't like walk around on dry land or dirt or anything like that, but they'll kind of live in these really muddy areas. And Aiden is asking, why do fish have scales? Great question, Aiden. Those scales help to protect their body, so they're like a protective coating on their body. So great question, Aiden. Awesome. Now, I had given you an assignment. Let's go back to our Blue Cavern exhibit. Your job was to look at these animals and see what you notice about them. And we were looking at 3 things. We were looking at their color, their fins, and their mouth, because those tell us a lot about how an animal lives. So, first off, their color. What did you notice about their color? I'm seeing that when we look here at this Blue Cavern exhibit, I'm seeing a lot of the same types of color. I'm seeing gray, I'm seeing silver, maybe a really dark greenish muted green color, maybe really dark browns. What I'm not seeing pinks and purples and blues and yellows. I'm not seeing those bright colors. We're seeing a lot of dark muted colors. Why do we think that might be? Why do these animals living in the kelp forest have dark coloration? Now, just like animals on land, animals living in the ocean are going to be colors that blend in with their habitat. So here in this habitat, we see a lot of shadows, we see dark, we see rocks. There is some green on the kelp, but it's a pretty muted green. So they're going to be the dark muted colors that blend in with this habitat. We've seen the tropical coral reef fish a couple times already today, and they have those bright colors because they blend in with bright habitats. Let's take a look at that second thing, though. Let's look at their fins. Let's see if we can pull up an animal. Other than this giant sea bass is blocking the camera a little bit. So let's take a look at another fish. Oh, here's that exception to that colorful rule that I talked about. Remember how I just said that fish living in the kelp forest are not colorful? This Garibaldi is the one exception to that rule, and that's because this is using it basically as warning coloration. This is one of the most territorial fish living in a kelp forest, and so it has this bright color to tell people and to tell other animals and to tell everyone living in the ocean basically to stay away. So it has this bright warning coloration. But let's look at this animal's fins. So I'm noticing it has these kind of heart-shaped tail. And that heart-shaped tail is really good for kind of cruising. So it has this tail shape that is good for cruising. It's going to use that tail a little bit. It'll also use the fins on the side to help it swim. And I want to see if we can go back to Blue Cavern. We might be able to get a look at a fish that has a different tail. So we've seen how this heart-shaped tail is good for cruising. We'll go back to our Blue Cavern exhibit and see if we can see any other tail shapes in the kelp forest. Now, we talked about how that Garibaldi is kind of defensive and territorial, so it usually stays pretty close to its nest where it's raising its eggs. Okay, perfect. We're going to look at a picture. Here we have another example. Look at this tail. This tail is different. This tail is a large paddle-shaped tail. Again, this is a slow-moving tail. So this tail is really just for cruising. This giant sea bass gets to be about 500 pounds. So it is not having to deal with very many predators. So it doesn't have to move quickly. It's just a slow-moving animal within the kelp forest. Now, there are some animals, though, that have a really V-shaped, fork-shaped tail. So it looks kind of like a V. Those are the fast ones. Those are the ones that are built for speed. Oh, perfect. Look at these. So you can see these yellowtail have these fork-shaped tails. They're related to fish like jack and tuna, and they are built for speed. They have this, it's called a fusiform body shape. Means that they're shaped kind of like a football, and then they have this fork-shaped tail. This fish is built to be fast, unlike those two fish we were just looking at, the Garibaldi and the giant sea bass. Now, I want to take a look at a different type of fish. We're going to dive now into a look at our one of our tropical fish. We'll go look at that butterfly fish and see how its body is different. What do you notice about this butterfly fish? How is its body different than the fish we were just looking at? Remember, we're looking at color, we're looking at their fins and their tail, and we're looking at their mouth, those three characteristics. Now, looking at their color, the first thing I notice is that it's really brightly colored. We see this kind of yellow, black, and white pattern on its body. It has a really unique pattern that helps it to blend in. So it's got these stripes that kind of breaks up its body, which can confuse their predators. It also has these bright colors that help it to blend in with coral. You can even see behind us, there's a lot of yellow in its habitat, so it's able to blend in. Another thing that I'm seeing right away is this. What do we think this might be? This is called a fake eye or a false eye. It looks kind of like the eye, and if you look at its real eye is being hidden with this bar here. So it's really difficult to see that real eye. And the purpose of this is that, first off, if you see an animal with a big eye like this, you're going to think that's a really big animal. The other thing is, if you see an animal with an eye on this side of its body, you're going to expect it to swim this way. You're going to think that this is the face and it's going to swim this way. So when this fish takes off swimming that way, it's going to confuse their predators. So this eye is meant for confusing predators. So we can see that this fish is probably a pretty frequently eaten as a prey item. Unlike the fish we were looking at earlier, which were more of predators. This is a prey fish, and so it has things like coloration and false eyes to help it blend in from its predators. We were also talking about their tail. Look at this tail. Is this a V-shaped tail like the yellow tail we saw earlier? Or is this a paddle-shaped tail like the giant sea bass? If you're saying it's a paddle-shaped tail, you are correct. This is a tail for cruising. This fish is not going to reach top speed. It can go fast for really short bursts, maybe to hide in the in the coral reef, but it's not going to be sustaining those speeds for a really long time. And then what I think is the most interesting part of this fish is the mouth. Look at the mouth on this fish. What do we think it eats? By observing the mouth of an animal, we can learn a lot about what it eats. So this mouth is small, right? This is a small mouth. So it's probably not eating really big food. In fact, it's eating very, very small food. It's eating things like small plankton, small fish, small shrimp, very, very tiny, tiny food items. It can also kind of pick at some of the little critters and animals that live on coral reefs. So it has this really, really tiny mouth. It also has a very long mouth so that it's able to get into those cracks and crevices on the coral reef. So this mouth is perfect for eating very, very small food. Now I want to go back. I know we were just looking at our giant sea bass, but I want to compare this mouth to the mouth of our giant sea bass. Wow, that is a very different mouth. What do you notice about this mouth? It's not tiny and it's not pointy. It's the complete opposite. It is huge and it has those really, really big lips. So what this fish is able to do is this fish can open up its mouth really, really big. And when it opens up its mouth, it creates this like vacuum that pulls all the water in front of it into its mouth. Oh, look at that mouth. It's like it's posing for us right here next to our camera of our Blue Cavern exhibit. So it opens up that mouth, pulls the water in, and guess what? If there are things like sardines or small fish right in front of it, when it opens up its mouth, it pulls those fish into its mouth as well. So it's able to kind of create this suction. So it uses its mouth in a very different way than that butterfly fish that we were just looking at. Here it is right here. Now, again, if you have any questions at all, please text those questions to us right here at 562-286-1838. I would love to get a chance to answer your questions about all of the fish that we have living here at the aquarium. So fish are one of the favorite things for people to see when they come to the aquarium. Let's take a look at our tropical reef exhibit so that we can get a chance to see some tropical fish. Since we've gotten a chance to see quite a few of our kelp forest fish, I want to see some of the fish that are living on our coral reefs. So we'll take a look at those tropical fish. Now I expect they'll probably be colorful, like we were talking about. They'll probably be colorful, but I bet we'll be able to see a lot of diversity. Coral reefs are one of the most diverse places on Earth. So there's lots of different types of animals, different, even within fish, there's going to be different shapes, different sizes, and different colors. Now here's our coral reef. You can see this is a pretty zoomed out view, but you can see all of the different animals that live on the coral reef. And even here in this exhibit, we can see that they live in different ways. So there are some fish that you can see that are kind of hanging out more in the open water. They're swimming around more. Those are going to be the bigger fish and the predators that are spending more time away from the coral reef. There are also some fish that are spending a lot of time tucked into the coral reef. They're swimming in the coral. They are hiding in the coral. They're laying their eggs in the coral. And those are the animals that are more likely to be prey, so that they're able to stick really close to the coral so that they can tuck into the coral and hide really easily. Now you can see there's lots of different types of fish here swimming around. What do you notice about these fish? How are they different? What similarities do they have? We looked at their color already. How about their body shape? I'm seeing quite a few of these. These are these bat fish. And I noticed that they are kind of flat. So a lot of the animals living in this habitat are going to be flat, almost like a vertical pancake. And this one is even round like a pancake as well. Now, the reason that these fish are going to be flat like a vertical pancake is so that they can hide in the cracks and crevices of that coral. Oh, very cool. Looks like they're swimming right by the camera so that we can get a closer look at them. Very cool. We even have, there's a yellowfish here swimming by, that fox-faced rabbitfish as well. So we see lots of these animals living here on the coral reef that are a little bit more that compressed body shape that we talked about. Now there are other fish swimming here that oh wow, look at that. There's a school of fish swimming by as well. Yeah, let's go ahead and take a second. We're going to look at another type of fish that can be found on coral reefs that we often don't think about when we think of fish, and that's a seahorse. So seahorse are kind of a unique type of fish. They are a fish, but their body is very, very different. So they still have those fins that we talked about. They still use gills for breathing, but they're obviously a different shape, and they have an extra part of their body that fish don't have, and that's this it's like a prehensile tail. Basically they're able to use this tail to hold on to things like seagrass or rocks, and they're able to hang on to keep safe from floating away. Now they have this fin here, but that fin is not very big, so it has this really small fin that it uses to swim basically. So again, not very big. Now let's look at their mouth. What do you notice about their mouth? Does it look similar to any of the mouths that we've seen so far? I think it looks kind of similar to that butterfly fish. Remember, it has that long pointed mouth with a very small mouth opening, and that's because they eat really similar foods. The seahorse eats things like plankton. They love to eat things like brine shrimp and mysid shrimp. So if you've ever raised sea monkeys at home before, that's one of their favorite foods. And so what they do is they're called an ambush predator. So they wait and they hide, and they're unseen by their prey, and then when those plankton swim by, they snap their mouth up and they just make this little teeny tiny snapping motion, and that's how they're able to grab onto their food items. So this is our seahorse here. Now seahorses are really unique in the fact that it's actually the males that will give birth to the babies. So after the eggs are fertilized, the eggs are transferred to the male. The male will hold them and kind of incubate them until they get a little bit bigger, and then they'll birth them. And the reason for that is that seahorses are really small. It takes a lot of effort for the female to create the eggs. So this helps to separate the burden of reproduction. So the female produces the eggs, the male incubates the fertilized eggs, and it kind of divides up that labor a little bit so that they're able to continue to reproduce more quickly while the female is able to make and hold their eggs. We got another question I want to take a second to answer. It says, if parrotfish eat coral, would the algae inside of them perform photosynthesis for the fish? Really good question. So this is a parrotfish. Parrotfish live on coral reefs, and they have these really unique mouths. They have these really sharp teeth. Here we can see these teeth, and these teeth are perfect for grinding and crunching coral. So they do feed on algae that's living in the coral. They also scrape off that coral and do eat some of the coral polyps as well, those little animals that make up the coral. So they do feed on that coral as well as the algae. Now when they eat it though, that algae does not survive being eaten basically. So it's not going to become a part of the parrotfish, although that would be really cool if there was a parrotfish that was able to have coral or an algae performing photosynthesis for it. That would be very cool. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. So if we have any last questions, go ahead and text those questions in. Also, if you are watching this at a later date, you can email us here live at lbaop.org. We'd love to get a chance to answer your questions. One last request is if there are any teachers out there viewing today, if you could text in the number of students that you have viewing. That helps us for our records. We like to get an idea of how many people we're reaching, and knowing how many students are in your class is one of the best ways that we can do that. So please just text us here how many students are viewing if you have a classroom watching with you. Well, I want to thank all of you very much today. I had a really great time learning with all of you. We have another program coming up at 10 a.m. So that's going to be, is animal health care, right? We're going to be learning all about animal health care. So if you've ever wondered about how we take care of all the animals you can see behind me, go ahead and stick around, come back at 10 a.m. so that you can hear from Allie talking all about how we take care of our animals. Thank you and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.